case of the Tamil family. Their lawyers returned to court today, as Trudy McIntosh reported earlier. Let's go to the Greens leader, Richard Di Natale. Richard Di Natale, thanks so much for your time. At every point, the claim for asylum has been repudiated. Right the way to the High Court, their case again was thrown out. Isn't the government simply following the law in this matter?
Well, no, because there's now an injunction, and obviously this matter still needs to play out through the courts. But, Kieran, firstly, we know that the situation in Sri Lanka is very volatile. We know that both of these people, just look at the facts here. There are a couple of people here who witnessed extreme brutality in the midst of an ongoing civil war. They came here, started a life. They were welcomed with open arms by a community in regional Australia who opened their hearts while the government had turned their backs on them. They've made a great contribution. They've had a couple of kids here whose home is Australia. This, for those children, is their home. It's the only place they've ever known. The government sweeps in the dead of night, a range of armed guards, rushes this family off onto a plane, and then, when faced with a rejection from the courts, decides to inflict more cruelty and suffering on them by sending them to Christmas Island. And we've got a community right across the country, many Australians, who are saying, look, enough's enough. This is cruel for the sake of being cruel. It achieves no purpose. Just show a bit of decency, let them stay, let them make a contribution here, and let them demonstrate what wonderful citizens people like this family can be.
The government has argued repeatedly, and again today via the Home Affairs Minister, that the adults have not been found to be refugees, and they were told that their refugee claim had been rejected, and at no point have they been given any indication that they'd be allowed to stay, and that was made clear to them prior to their having 2 children here. If they make an exception in this case, their argument is that it would provide more incentive for people smugglers to pursue their business case.
Well, that's nonsense. No one seriously is suggesting that by using ministerial discretion in this case it's going to have any impact on what happens anywhere else. That's just nonsense. Australia's reputation for cruelty is well known right across the world now. The reality is that this showing a bit of decency and humanity in this case would do nothing other than to allow people who have been severely traumatised and brutalised, firstly in a civil war in their own country of origin, their home country, and now at the hands of the Immigration Department, would just allow them to make a contribution to a regional community who wants them to stay. This idea that somehow this sends a message is nonsense. This is cruelty for the sake of being cruel. It achieves no other purpose other than to impose more suffering on a family that's already been traumatised. That's all it does.
Do you accept, though, that they've not been found to be refugees?
Well, that's a matter of fact at the moment, except it must also be said that the case of one of these children is yet to be heard. But the reality is, yes, that the Immigration Department has denied refugee status to the 2 parents involved. But that doesn't mean that the minister can't use ministerial discretion. Indeed, he's used it in the past, and ministerial discretion exists so that you can look at the individual circumstances of each case and make a determination. And in this case, 2 people raising a family in a regional community, welcomed into that community with open arms. And I have to say, what a show of generosity and what a show of what good Australians can do, opening up their hearts to a family in need. And they've been repaid because they have been, by all accounts, model citizens in that regional community. So what we should do is the minister here should just recognise, indeed he's got people inside his own party who are expressing a view here. When Barnaby Joyce and Alan Jones are all saying, look, just show a bit of heart and let this family stay. When millions of people right around the country are saying the same thing, when there are marches on Father's Day. Think about that. While I was celebrating Father's Day with my 2 young boys, trying to explain why we were at a rally where a government has said to a family, 2 young kids, in the dead of night, rushed onto an aeroplane, now languishing in an offshore jail, where no one else is, by the way. That says something about how far this government has
You've said it's senseless cruelty and cruelty for the sake of being cruel. Mr Dutton, obviously, well, he says those remarks are disgusting and should be condemned, and that he described it as self-indulgent approach in the comments, promoting nothing more than your own failed agenda. And he said today in the Courier Mail he hasn't had one death at sea on his watch and he doesn't intend to let that happen now. Is it unfair to be saying it's cruelty for cruelty's sake, given they believe, the government, the minister, that this policy has saved lives?
There's no other explanation for it, because no one would seriously suggest this would make a jot of difference to our refugee policies and what happens in other countries. I mean, no one for a moment would suggest that this would do anything other than allow a family that's already been brutalised at the hands of, firstly, a civil war in Sri Lanka and now at the hands of this government. No one would suggest it would do anything other than allow them to get on with their lives and allow them to make a contribution to this country. There's no reason to do this. There is no reason to do it. It doesn't send any other message other than this is a cruel and heartless government. So what the Prime Minister should do now is intervene. He talks about how important it is to show a bit more love and expresses his Christian values, where there's nothing more Christian than recognising the suffering of others and opening up your heart and allowing young children. I mean, these kids are being traumatised right now. This will have a lasting impact forever on these kids. What we should do is just recognise that in this case, the minister can intervene. He can allow this family to stay in Biloela, a country community who have said, we want them here. They're model citizens. They've made a great contribution to our town. This is an opportunity to show a bit of compassion and decency and to reflect the Christian values that the Prime Minister often talks about.
We've seen report today the Border Force stopped a boat carrying 13 suspected illegal immigrants from Sri Lanka on August 7. There have been 6 such ventures since May. The government's clearly concerned that there has been an uptake, an increase in that number. This case obviously is parallel to that, but obviously they don't want to provide any incentive to those people smuggling ventures.
Well, how convenient. I mean, what a coincidence that it so happens on the back of criticism from his own people, from people like Barnaby Joyce and Alan Jones, that there's a front page story in the News Limited tabloids. I'm waiting for the investigation into the leak that occurred to trigger those headlines. We're told how important it is that for the sake of national security, for the sake of the integrity of protecting our borders, that we can't discuss these matters. And wow, what a coincidence. Front page of the Australian, here we are. Again, the government scaring the living daylights out of people about the arrival of more innocent asylum seekers. Look, I don't buy it. What I know is that this government has done everything it can to manipulate this policy for their own narrow political purposes. We've got them working basically with the propaganda arm of the Liberal Party, the Australian, to try and, again, scare the living daylights out of people about a problem that simply doesn't exist. The reality is, Kieran, that we have, in Australia, treated innocent people with cruelty. We've created mental illness factories in offshore camps overseas. We've implemented a regime that is something you'd expect to see in some of the most brutal dictatorships around the world. We've seen armed guards storm a family, basically ram them onto a plane and now have them languishing in an offshore jail so that they can beat their chests and continue to try and use fear and division within the community. I don't buy it. The reality is that what we have here is an instance where a family could be allowed to stay, they could make a contribution. Okay. And the reason the government doesn't want to do it, Kieran, is because they know when we start putting a face, when we start identifying with these people as people, that Australians' views on this tend to soften. And the government doesn't want to do that. It doesn't want to allow us
when you say you
to
don't buy it,
recognise that we're talking about human beings.
You're saying that those 6 ventures didn't happen? Are you rejecting that report when you say you don't buy it?
Well,
it seems pretty factual, that report.
Well, what I'm saying is what a coincidence that here we are the day after, you know, millions of Australians are expressing concern about this family, that we've got a report on the front page of the Australian. I mean, that seems to me to be a remarkable coincidence, Kieran, and I think it's a government, again, using its propaganda arm to do its bidding. That's what it is.
Let's finish off on comments made by Rebecca White, the Labor state leader in Tasmania, who says the Greens are holding the state back and it's because they only ever provide a voice for the few. She's said she's not going to make the same mistake again in joining forces with the Greens. What do you say to Rebecca White's remarks in relation to the Greens' approach in Tasmania?
I say to Rebecca White, as I say to federal Labor counterparts, is you've got a decision to make. You either abandon your policies for action on climate change, for universal healthcare and decent education for all, and try and become basically a version of the Liberal Party light, or you work with the Greens for strong action on climate change, for investment in universal healthcare and education. And right now it's pretty obvious that the Labor Party have decided to try and basically become a pale version of the Liberal Party. And if they're going to abandon the space that many Australians want to see, where a real opposition is taking the fight up to this government, working to get strong action on climate change, doing everything that we can to try and get an investment in free university, in an investment in TAFE, Medicare-funded dental care for everybody. If they want to abandon that space and basically become the Liberal Party light, well, it's the Greens will be the real opposition here. We want to work with the Labor Party to turf this government out. If they want to work with the Liberal Party and basically become another version of the Liberal Party, well, we'll take the fight up to both of them.
Richard Di Natale, appreciate your time. Thanks.
Thanks, Kieran.